So every February, we hold this event, the State of Black Philanthropy, as part of our celebration of Black History Month. It's a space where donors and local leaders can come together and determine how to effectively invest charitable dollars around issues that they want to champion. Over the past 4 years, many who have come to these events have been inspired by what they've heard. And they've launched personalized donor funds, projects, they've dedicated proceeds from their estates to charity, and they've pooled charitable dollars together to have a greater impact than any one of us can have alone. Tonight is about opening up the platform of philanthropy and making it accessible to everyone, understanding and exploring the different strategies that can be deployed, and using all these strategies to help the residents in Miami who need it the most. You're invited here tonight because you all are in a position to do this work. Whether it's an individual, a family, a business, a nonprofit, a governmental leader, our hope is that you walk away inspired and with some concrete ideas about how you can take action. Last year, we heard successful strategies and lessons learned from donors who have been inspired by this event and launched charitable projects as a result. One such presentation was by Ghislaine Garage of the Ayiti Community Trust, and I know we have trustees of Ayiti in the house tonight. Where are you? Thank you. The Ayiti Community Trust started as a very small meeting in my office, maybe what, Greta, 4 years ago? 4 years ago? And they said, you know, we have this idea, we have this dream to establish and build the first endowed community foundation in Haiti. I said, okay, let's get to work. And through a tremendous amount of work by this volunteer board and a number of people at the foundation staff, including Rebecca Mandelman, who's with us today, they have created an incredibly impressive movement to build endowment dollars for a country that desperately needs this type of philanthropic leadership. And just this past weekend, they had an incredibly successful first inaugural gala that I heard was the best Haitian event ever in Miami, is what I heard. And so tonight, I'm pleased to introduce you to Melba Pearson, similarly inspired by what she's heard at these events over past years, and a group of women who have joined her to launch a new local giving initiative. These women were looking for a way to empower Black women and girls and found the solution through philanthropy and the establishment of a fund at the Miami Foundation. So I'd now like to invite Melba and her colleagues up to the podium to tell their story.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to extend a word of thank you to the Miami Foundation for hosting the State of Black Philanthropy and for lifting up the work of organizations such as us that care deeply about the community. Sankofa Sisters Giving Circle was founded by a group of Black women to support meaningful and systemic change that empowers Black women and girls. We believe in giving back to the community. We leverage our resources to address systemic inequalities at the intersection of gender, race, and class. We weren't familiar with the concept of a giving circle at first, but Joyce and I, being of Jamaican descent, knew of the concept called PADNA, which basically, partner, where communities came together with their resources to assist someone in maybe buying a house or do a wedding or something along those lines. It was that idea of communities coming together to support each other. And with that desire in our hearts, and knowing that we stand on the shoulders of others, we did not get here by accident. We got here because someone helped us. Somebody gave us a chance. Somebody supported us. Someone sacrificed. So we felt it was incumbent upon us to do the same and to do the same for our communities. We wanted to help smaller grassroots organizations who sometimes lose out to funding to larger organizations that may have more resources, more ability to get their voices out there, while the smaller grassroots organizations who were doing the work didn't get the same chance. We named the organization Sankofa. It is loosely translated from the Twi language of Ghana to say, go back and get it. Go back and get it. And we named it Sisters because, well. There are many foundations that we could have chosen to host our Giving Circle. But we chose Miami Foundation for a very specific reason. Number one, we looked at their board and their staff, and we saw diversity. We saw our faces reflected in the representation of the Miami Foundation. Secondly, the State of Black Philanthropy was an event that we haven't heard of in any other context, at least in Florida. So the fact that Miami Foundation was willing to go out on a limb and start something new and innovative to uplift the voices of the Black community was something that spoke to us as well. So just to keep it really real, none of us here are rich, okay? We're rich in blessings, but the bank account is what it is, right? One of our sisters was affected by the government shutdown. So when it came to, okay, let me see if I can get my money together to get this Giving Circle together, we knew that we needed to make certain sacrifices. And I say this not to put our business on Front Street, but I say this because this means that you can do the same. Whether it be support us because you support the mission of the work we're doing for Black women and girls. You can like us on Facebook. It's Sankofa Sisters Giving Circle on Facebook. You can reach out to us that way. You can donate. Or if there's another issue that's close to your heart, you can start a Giving Circle as well. You don't need millions or even thousands to do it. You just need to have a group and a desire. And for the organizations in the room that are doing work around Black women and girls, we are pleased to announce that our application process is now live, and we are accepting applications for 2019. So please, if you meet that criteria, I encourage you, don't self-deselect. I encourage you to apply. And let's see what we can do together. I will close by saying this, my favorite quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. If you can't fly, run. If you can't run, walk. If you can't walk, crawl. But whatever you do, you keep moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so very, very much for that. Rich in blessings. I can't think of a better way to describe the work that we're all doing to build this community and the calling that each of us has to give back to this community. So thank you all so very much for what you're doing. And if anyone in this room feels similarly inspired, let us know if we can be a partner to you. That is our core mission in this community, is to build philanthropy and to help people who are rich in blessings and want to give back to this community do so in an effective way, in a powerful way, in an impactful way. I'd like to take a brief moment to welcome another one of our trustees who has walked in, Mr. Berkowitz, Richard Berkowitz. Thank you for joining tonight. Many of the issues that we end up partnering with our Black philanthropists in particular around have to do with the intersection of government, policy, and philanthropy. Whether it's around education or affordable housing, there are so many issues that we have in our community. It's when the nonprofit community, the funding community, foundations, government, individuals all come together at a shared table to create those solutions. Policy that moves the community forward in a collective, unified way. The Detroit Grand Bargain, which you're going to hear about tonight, is perhaps the greatest example of how these many different people from so many different sectors can come together to literally save a city. And we're incredibly privileged to have Tonya Allen with us tonight. Tonya is the president and CEO of the Skillman Foundation. Tonya and I know each other from our time serving on the Council of Foundations board together. She's a very dear friend, but she's an incredible advocate and leader in Detroit and throughout the entire state of Michigan and our country, advocating on behalf of our most marginalized people and our most marginalized communities with a specific focus on educational attainment. Tonya has done, and Skillman has done tremendous work to lift graduation rates, to connect youth to jobs in the summertime, to help get the necessary funding for Detroit public schools. But when the Grand Bargain came together, it was Tonya's voice at the table, making sure that the Grand Bargain was always grounded in helping the residents of Detroit, not just propping up its institutions. It was that voice that made the Grand Bargain the model that it is today for these types of collaborations. So you'll hear about her 2 decades of experience working at this intersection between philanthropy and government. To help guide the conversation tonight, we've invited our friend Andrew Sherry, who's Vice President for Communications for Knight Foundation. As many of you probably know, the Knight Foundation has strong local roots in Miami and Detroit, in addition to a number of other cities around the country where the Knight brothers owned and published newspapers. Andrew's background is as a journalist and a digital strategist for USA Today and the Center for American Progress. That was prior to his joining Knight Foundation. We're excited about this conversation. I know there's going to be time for a dialogue with the audience as well, so let's get it started. Please join me in welcoming Andrew and Tonya to the stage.
Hey, y'all. It's good to be in Miami, particularly after driving through an ice storm to the airport this morning. So, yeah, I know y'all don't know nothing about that, but it's good to be here.
Well, Tonya, thanks for being here, and I'm glad it wasn't too hard to convince you to come down to Miami from Detroit in February. Now, when we first met, it was in the fall of 2013. Can you just describe what was going on with Detroit, with the energy of the city at the time, and then what was going on with the finances of the city at the time?
Right. So I think one of the things that most people don't understand about Detroit is that you hear so much in the national narrative and the national media that talks about Detroit's decline. And when you get images of what it looked like in Detroit, I would think you would kind of scratch your head a little bit and say, what were they thinking or what were they doing? Why wasn't anybody trying to save the city? And I think what you saw when we met and what we saw in 2013 was essentially people who had been working probably for 40 years trying to figure out how to change the trajectory of a city. And they were doing great innovations, smart work, investing lots of money, but they were investing it on a weak foundation. And the foundation was basically our municipal government. So everything we built would dissipate, or everything we built, we were trying to, I call it a big-ass workaround. Like, that's what we were trying to do. Like, success in Detroit was working around the institutions that were actually supposed to be the anchor to our community. And so and we knew that, but how do you fix a city government? And the other part of it was that we didn't really have full transparency on what was happening with our municipal finances. Yes, we knew that there was state policy that basically was essentially making our cities go broke because they weren't sharing revenue. Yes, we knew we were selling off assets in the city, but we kept getting all of this information that said that we have a balanced budget every single year. But what we didn't know was that we didn't have a balanced balance sheet. And so, it finally became really clear because the issues around, particularly around our retirees, that we were not funding we had unfunded pension liabilities that were basically draining our city. And then we also had a lot of debtors that were standing in line. And it all became clear also in the midst of, our mayor going to jail, that kind of thing. We had a whole bunch of stuff going on. But I'd like to say about Detroit, though, is that our city was broken, but our people were not. And so I really would be happy during this evening to talk to you about the resiliency, the passion, the leadership, the vision of some amazing people who live in our city, and I know they live in your city too, and I know that you are a part of that community and that tribe. And so my goal is to make sure that all of you tribe members understand who you are and exert the power that you have to create change. And so since we're using our favorite quotes, one of mine is Nelson Mandela's, "It's always impossible until it's done."
So the pension obligations were hanging over Detroit like a dark cloud and, threatening all the recovery was happening in the city, so Detroit decided to declare bankruptcy.
Well, we didn't decide to declare bankruptcy.
Detroit had no choice.
Well, we didn't have a choice. I mean, part of what people don't know is that we actually had a state takeover. Our governor called an emergency, put in an emergency manager, who I think has ties to Detroit, Robert Bob. I'm not Robert Bob. We have so many emergency managers. I'm mixing them up. It's Kevin Orr. But Kevin Orr became our emergency manager, and he basically walked us through a process to file for a bankruptcy.
So from what I recall, so it ended up on the docket of a very experienced bankruptcy judge, Gerald Rosen, and he did what a good bankruptcy judge does. If you want to go fast, you got to get everybody to agree and not fight it out in court. So in other words, you have to divide up the asset, everybody takes a haircut, but you move it through quickly. Problem is, when he looked at the books, he found out there basically were no assets. So do you want to say where they looked next?
Except one. There was one asset, right? And that was our museum, the Detroit Institute of Art. And for you who have never been to Detroit and maybe not even been to the Detroit Institute of Arts, just to give you context around that, Detroit at one point was the richest city in the world. Not the United States, the world. And so just imagine during that time the amount of money they spent to create a world competing art institution so that they could shame New York City, right? Or shame Paris. So just think about that. Like, think about this industrious, young, rich city, new money. And what would they build? It was that, which was the Detroit Institute of Art, that became the major asset that sat on the table for us as a community to negotiate with our debtors on.
And basically, as little as Judge Rosen liked the idea of selling off all those Monets and Picassos to Russian oligarchs and sheikhs in Dubai, that was the asset that was on the table. And they basically figured out, I wonder if we can leverage this some way to get money in so I can make this bankruptcy process move. And that's when the appeal was made to the foundations. Hey, do you want to come, and will you come and provide money that will be used to fund pensions in Detroit, get us through the bankruptcy quickly, and as part of that, the Detroit Institute for Art will become an independent nonprofit.
Well, and I probably would cast it slightly different. I think the negotiation was, will you come and give money so we can protect this asset? We don't want to sell our art. And I think that later morphed into, how do we use that in essentially a grand bargain where we protect the art and also negotiate and allow other people to come. So I'm using code language. Let me just go straight at it. So here's my perspective on it. Initially, it was called the Art Trust. So just from its name, you can tell essentially what it was about. It was about preserving the art. It later became, and I think morphed into a narrative that was really about how we save the city. And I'm not in any way suggesting that people did not have that intention early, but I do think that it was not as present when we talked about bringing money together to use that as a negotiating tool to protect the art and then also force our debtors to go into negotiation. And one of the biggest debtors in the city was our pensioners. And so what I was concerned about, and I think you were gonna probably walk me right into it, Andrew, my big concern was that maybe we should have talked about the people's trust first, right? And then let's talk about how we would get to the art issue. But that wasn't the direction of the conversation, which really gave me heartburn. And if you know me, and the people who do really know me, if I have heartburn, everybody having heartburn.
That's great. Well, Knight Foundation agreed to participate in this really early. So that's why it's interesting to talk about why Skillman hesitated and then what finally brought you to the table. In our case, it was a couple of things. One was a very strong connection to the city, from the foundation. Jack Knight had been the publisher of the Detroit Free Press, and when Alberto Ibargüen, our boss, went to our board and said we want to contribute $20 million to helping move Detroit through bankruptcy, Jack Knight's niece, who's on our board, stood up and said, "That's not enough." Jack Knight loved Detroit, and that the Free Press was his paper, and so then the board voted $30 million. So this is sort of the inside relationship stories that kind of make this happen. I think the other inside story I heard is that the judge first asked the head of the community foundation, Miriam Nolan, if she could get some foundations together to do this when he bumped into her at the deli in her office building. But once again, she was just the right person to ask because the community foundation is the connector. So she was the one who ended up pulling in what ended up being 12 or 13 different foundations to participate.
So I think one of the things that's amazing about this is that essentially, I think Alberto and Knight was the first foundation to come in. And I think that he set the tone for a lot of other foundations to come in. And he not only did he set the tone, he urged people to come in equitably. So if you had more, give more. If you had less, give less. And we had lots of debates on it. He had heartburn too during some of those conversations. But I think the other thing I would just say about it is, so the moral of the story is all of us came in at some point or another. Skillman came in last, and I'll tell you why I came in last. Put money together. That money was used to essentially protect the art and to also help ease all of the negotiations so that we could move through bankruptcy. It was the quickest bankruptcy, municipal bankruptcy in the history of municipal bankruptcies. We, I think, came through it in probably like 17 months? Yeah, 16, 17 months or so. And as a result of it, it really has put the city on a different trajectory. My heartburn around this was that a couple things. So I had a few really big concerns. And some of them bore to be real concerns. The first was I thought we were setting a precedent. We were taking these dollars as institutions. So even though we might be private foundations or public foundations, we're holding money for the public trust. Like, we're holding them privately. Sometimes people will say, well, this was the donor, it's his money. No, actually it isn't. It stopped being his money when he put it in a foundation and got a tax break. It became the public's money. So what I really worried about was that, one, we were setting a precedent on how we were using philanthropic dollars. The second thing I was very concerned about was that, were we misusing our power in that? And what I mean by that is that our money on the table became a bargaining chip to force pensioners to settle, or to highly encourage them to settle, whether they were really ready or not. I mean, the pressure was on them. And then the third thing was that I didn't feel like I felt like what we were doing in a lot of ways, and I don't think it was intentionally us, but we were positioning it as like philanthropy as the hero. And I was very concerned about that, because I'm like, our job is to give away money. So what's so heroic about that? When it is not the job of pensioners to give up their money. And so when we talk about the average pension being about $23,000 in the city of Detroit, to give up 10% is a huge hit. And so we aren't talking about that. We aren't talking about how we preserve those precious resources for families. So I felt like in a lot of ways, you could cut your nose off to spite your face, whatever, you know what I'm talking about that saying. Like that we were basically, if we're undermining the economic security of the people who live in the city, how does that make the city fundamentally better? We needed to figure out how to try and do both and get the best out of it. And I think we did pretty well despite those concerns, but some of them, I think, showed up later.
Yeah, it's an amazing and complex story, but at the same time, it's very much of a one-off in many ways. It's almost kind of a unicorn of a solution. How does change happen when you're not relying on foundations to swoop down from the sky and put tens of millions of dollars into something like that? I mean, most of the things that you work with in Detroit, right, they're about systemic change. So can you talk more about how you see systemic change happen and how you approach it in your work?
Right. So I'm going to answer that question, but I want to answer the question that you set me up on, which is how do you create change without this kind of philanthropic capital? I actually think we let our state off the hook. So philanthropy put in more money than the state did. Think about that. And so what ended up happening as a result of that was that when later on I had to come, because it wasn't just our city that was in bankruptcy, our school district was essentially at the brink of bankruptcy as well. And so when I was working and negotiating with these legislators, what they would say is, well, where's our grand bargain? I was like, you don't have one. This is your liability. Why would I pay for your liability? You pay for it. And so that ended up being a hilarious story. I think I'm the only grant maker in the state of Michigan that has had press releases placed on them. Again, the legislators were so mad at me because I would say, no, I'm not negotiating with you. Why would I give you money that belongs to children so you can pay your debts, that you created the situation? And so that was the question, was like, well, where's the grand bargain? There is no grand bargain. You're the grand bargain. And so what is interesting about that, with the work that we did, which was very much about building this coalition of civic and community leaders and business and labor to focus on saving that school district from bankruptcy, we got more money than the city of Detroit did to save it. Like, we got $700 million. The city only got about $400 million. So it's, in some ways, we kind of played ourselves, right? And so I think even though we did we stepped in the gap, and I think that was important, and that stepping in the gap created a lot more opportunity, but it also created this expectation, and other places have it too. Other cities call all the time because they're getting requests about, well, can you do that grand bargain thing that Detroit did to help us with our pension liabilities? Right. And that's an issue that is so deep across almost every single city that has any legacy in our country that we can't solve it with a private solution. We got to figure out a public solution around that. So I didn't answer your question around systemic change.
Well, no, this is a good way to jump into it, though, because what you just mentioned was a area where you were very successful using a completely different technique. And I expect most of the people in this room, they're interested in philanthropy. They don't want to do philanthropy just because it makes them feel good. They're concerned about impact. And I expect many people are drawn here because we've been talking about how different people, different types of organizations, different bodies can work together for impact. And I started picking up that you had the success on that educational campaign largely because of the ability to build coalitions and bring different people together. And can you say if that's the case and just talk a little bit more about how it played out?
I absolutely will. And one of the things you said, Andrew, when we were sitting down, you were talking about building, you were saying organized money, organized people. And I'm an old community organizer, and that's the definition of power, right? Organized people or organized money. I actually went into philanthropy because I felt like it was enough people working on the organizing the people part. We needed somebody to work on the organizing money. And so I went into that field, into this field, thinking about it as a lever for impact, not because I particularly wanted to run a foundation. But my whole belief around this is that any element of change has to kind of have 4 components. This is really technical, so I don't want to get wonkus on you, but it has to be the head, the heart, the hand, and the pocket. So for me, it has to make business sense, right? It has to be logical. It has to have a moral grounding, the heart part of it. It has to have something that you can do, like you have to put some labor in. And then the last part is that you got to also add some financial capital to it. If you can get those 4 components, I think that you can create change. That's the way I think about just in general. So building this coalition to me was really about figuring out how I could speak to the head, the heart, the hand, and the pocket of various sectors in the community to get something done, and to get something done on behalf of children in the state, and so in the city rather. And what was so interesting about it is, I'm sure in your community, just like in my community, if you talk about education, the issue that should bring us all together is the one that divides us. What I would find is that, so I would just start with simple things by saying, like, 1, can we agree to leave all of our weapons at the door? And let's just walk in the room and figure out if we can, 2, go with what I call the 70-20-10 principle. And that is simply that if you're working on any issue, the majority of the time, 70% of whatever needs to happen, you can agree on. There's 20% that you can negotiate on. You may not be able to, but most times you can negotiate. And then there's 10% that is a non-starter. And the challenge for us was that we always started at the 10%. And so what I would try to do is convince them that we could start at 70% and see how close we could get to 90 as we could, and see what that would look like for our families and for our kids. And that really required that not people just come to a table. Everybody had to put their own money in. Everybody had to put labor in. Everybody had to bring their own intellectual capital. Everybody had to start with beginning to expose themselves and build trust. And I'm a big believer in the trust quotient, and that is, now of course I'm trying to quote it and I probably will forget it, but it's basically, the trust quotient is reliability, intimacy, and somebody else knows it in this audience. You could yell it out to me and help me. Reliability, intimacy, and something else, but whether or not you believe somebody knows what they're doing. And then you divide that by their self-interest. So in order to get to trust, you actually have to be present. right? Like you have to be near people and they have to get to know who you are and what you can contribute. And so just by building that trust, that when we got to a fight on this stuff with our legislature, because it was really a fight, everybody knew that we each had each other's back because we knew what everybody's non-negotiables were and what things were negotiable. And so we were able to really pull together and win, I think, which was pretty heroic. And I think it was shocking to our city because we just hadn't won in Lansing, which is our state capital, in such a long time. And I think that set this kind of trajectory that, yes, we can do this. And it really does take all of us. And if all of us can get together around the table and contribute in a meaningful way, then we can create change.
So what were the contributions of the various groups? And for example, if you're an individual philanthropist and you care about the future of kids, about the schools, and you're seeing something like this unfold, how did people get involved?
Yeah, well, we had lots of ways for people to get involved, but the first way that before we actually dug into, so let's define philanthropy, and then let's talk about how you deploy it. So philanthropy is, its basic form is the love of people, right? And so I think that a lot of times when we talk about philanthropy, we get caught up in this institutional definition of what philanthropy looks like. That it's about capital and deploying capital. Yeah, it is, but I think we're too narrow in our definition of what capital is. Capital isn't just money. Capital is labor, it's intellectual capital, it's influential capital, and what I would say is, but it all has to be driven from a place of love. I don't talk about love as a, soft, touchy-feely thing, even though it is that too. It is an action word, right? And so if you are gonna do this work, you have to come from this place of kind of radical love, like a fierceness. The best example is like Claire Huxtable. Ain't nobody messing with Claire Huxtable, right? She has that kind of fierce love where she shows up. She's not gonna do it for you, but she's gonna be a caretaker and a supporter for you and help you get through the work. And so, so when I think about individual philanthropy, I think about that as the same way. What's your capital? How are you bringing your multiple sources of capital to be able to deploy it? Yes, you can give money, and it doesn't have to be a lot of money to create change, but you can also add hard work to that, because this giving circle wouldn't be successful if you guys didn't come. The Haiti Foundation, which I'm missing the correct name, wouldn't come to existence if people didn't come to the table with labor first. And so what we tried to do was to create multiple entry points, multiple ramps. You could get in any kind of way you wanted to. So we went after a lot of conservative people who would not normally be on a coalition like this. And our first way of getting them was we didn't ask them for money. We're we want your influence. That's the capital we want. We want you to go into Lansing. We want you to sit in the room with people who will not respect me if I came in the room. We knew that, and we understood it, and we said it explicitly. We need you to go, and we need you to talk to them about this, and we need you to use the language that will allow them to hear this issue, that they are liable, they are responsible. They kept talking about it as a bailout for Detroit public schools. And it's how is it a bailout for Detroit public school if you were on the line? It's actually a bailout for the state. And so helping them understand things that they would not, and to move from some of that coded language that was embedded with historic relationships, historic narratives, and historic racism.
That's really interesting, because you're talking about pulling people together from groups that had maybe historically been disparate in order to achieve a goal. And I mean, did you do that through the way you communicated on the issue? I mean, what were the key factors that brought these people together from different backgrounds?
I think it was the way we communicated together. It was how we learned together, and I think it was how we trusted together. And then it is also about, I don't want to suggest that money isn't important. I think money is extraordinarily important. And then we created vehicles for them to put money in. And so we were very intentional about it. And for many of us, we have these deep relationships, particularly African American community, where sometimes we may not be running companies, but we might be in these very powerful positions. And how are we using and asking people specifically ways that they could advance the work? So for example, one of the things we were really clear about was like we needed to lobby. So we went to people who said, I want to get in on this. They were corporate leaders. And we said, well, the one thing we just need you to deliver is like we need some unencumbered money, because you know unencumbered capital is the best capital of all. And so we need that so we can use it to pay for pieces that we need, of work we need to do. And then we also need you to use your corporate lobbyists to go out and argue our points too. So like beginning to get people to use their resources that most of us don't think that we can retool or use to move our agenda.
Yeah. So you've worked in Detroit and had some real successes on some areas that are really pressing issues in Miami as well, such as housing affordability, youth gun violence. You know, can you talk to us a bit about that and what you did that worked that we might be able to take from that?
Yeah, so I can talk particularly about gun violence, and then I wouldn't proclaim that we've had success on housing stability, but I can tell you what we're doing.
Right.
So on gun violence, we actually didn't tackle this issue as a gun violence issue. We tackled it as a community safety issue. And so we started our conversations with partners across the community, including police and people who were in the kind of legal part of it, the justice system. We started in nonprofits, community groups, radio patrols. We asked everybody, what would it look like if we really doubled down to make sure our kids were safe? Like, what would we each do if we all made the commitment that we're going to double down to make sure our children are safe? What would we all do differently? And interesting enough, it forced all of us to do more than what we were doing. It also forced us to behave and talk to each other in ways that we had never talked to each other before. And it forced us to invest in ways that we never invested before. And so I'll give you an example. We have a group called the Detroit Crime Commission in Detroit, and they have basically mastered technology. So they have, you know, people from every level of government who retired at the top of their game come together. They get in some master room, and then they figure out like how to use technology to track gang behaviors. And so we did all of this work, and we ended up and talked to the community and worked on it, and it became like this multi-pronged strategy where we had community organizing. We said that this is a cultural problem, so we did restorative practices at every level where police officers, because it wasn't about just decreasing crime, we wanted to decrease criminalization. So we didn't want to like reduce crime and have more kids going to jail. That just seems like counterproductive. And so we made sure that police officers were trained in restorative practices, that they could de-escalate events as they were going through it. We provided trauma-centered care in hospital emergency rooms, because if a young person was shot, they were more likely to go out and shoot somebody else because their trauma was never affected or dealt with properly. We had, you know, the technology pieces going on. We had investments in neighborhood patrols, community organizing in hot spots where crime came out. So all of this work and then we set tables where people would work together collaboratively, and out of that, we had a lot of just great innovations where young people were leading tables for police and adults, talking about what crime looked like and how they experienced it in their communities. Now, this was only in 6 neighborhoods in Detroit, and Detroit is a pretty big place. So let's just say it's about a third of the city, geography-wise. And in that, we saw a 40% decrease in crime in those places and a 40% decrease in child victimization. And we saw that over a 5-year period. So it was like working hard, getting proactive about what you want to do, being clear about how we all can show up in a different way, and be really intentional about the result and the outcome we wanted, and measuring it and saying it.
I want to hear your thoughts on affordable housing, but just following up on that example, you said something at the beginning about it was how you framed what you were trying to do. It's like what you framed it in terms of the goal and what you were going to measure. Is that something, you know, very intentional? And do you find that it's something that really does change behavior? It's just focusing on the goal in a different way? And is it something that, you know, we should be looking at when we look at nonprofits to fund how they are defining their goals?
Yeah, I always say keep your eye on 2 things, the thermostat and a thermometer. And so the thermometer is your snapshot of the current, of what actually exists right now. But the thermostat is your vision. Like, that's where you want the temperature of the room to be. And if you are, my husband always says, like, I'm the thermostat. He's like, how you show up in the house sets the tone. So I took that advice. I don't know if it was a compliment, but I took that advice, and I try and apply it to the work that we're doing, that let's look at the thermometer, let's pay attention to it, but let's never get too focused on that. That just tells us data is just data. It's just points of information. Data doesn't define you, it just informs you. And so the thermometer is the place where we want, that's where we use that to define who we want to be and get people to focus on that. If we can focus on who we want to be more than we want to focus on who we are today, then I think we can move the steps there. Because, you know, I think people make change seem really far more complex than it actually is. Like, I actually think if you do anything with fidelity, something's going to change. And I think the challenge is most of us don't do anything with fidelity, right? Like, our cities don't do things with fidelity. Half of us don't. I don't do my workout program with fidelity, and nothing changes. And so I think the key to all of this is set a vision and execute with fidelity. Like, just focus on what you want to do and look for people who have that fire to be able to stick with what they're doing. That if they run into a problem, that they're going to look at that problem, investigate it, iterate, and move forward. And I think that we're not, you know, I think people get so caught up, particularly in communities that don't have a ton of wealth. So when you get something, you think like, oh, you know, I have to do it exactly the way I said it, even if it's not working for you. And so, to me, fidelity is the process of sticking to the process that gets you to change, not necessarily sticking to the mechanics of a process or of a change process. And I think that's what we need to be looking for when we're looking for leaders. And I think, you know, I'm just gonna be honest, like, we Black folk, so, and the ones that's not, y'all can be honorary tonight. This is what I would just say is, like, you know, sometimes we're looking for that passionate, eloquent leader who is going to speak passion into us. And that's useful sometimes. It's useful, no, it's not. It's useful all the time. It's useful to get us ignited. It is not useful to sustain us. And we have to think about, like, how we create, I think, a bench of leaders that allow us to ignite that will allow us to sustain, that allows us to grow, that allows us to build. If we can have that bench of leaders who help us look through the whole continuum of change, I think we'll be better. But when we look for one person who's going to help us do it all, and we all know that. I mean, it's the challenges of that kind of martyr leadership or hero leadership. And I often describe it as I talk about it as not being hero leadership, but how do we create host leadership? How do we become the people that actually host a table for multiple leaders to come, figure out how they work together? And philanthropists are leaders too. So how do we, and I think that the Miami Foundation is doing just that. They're trying to be hosts to your leadership. How do they create a table that enables you to be able to do your work more effectively, smarter, and more impactfully?
Yeah, I'd like to go into that more. You know, something you said earlier, you know, about power. The reason you need power is because trying to face historic inequities that go back centuries, right? And so that takes power to change, and what you said, organize people and organize money. What can the Black community, the Black philanthropy community in particular, take away from that in terms of, I don't know, what do you see in terms of the Black philanthropic community in Detroit, let's say? Do people, we know that, African American households on average give 25% more of their, income to charity than the population at large. There's a strong church-growing tradition. Are they thinking of, are you seeing a lot of giving which is just for a specific sort of social service cause, or do you see, is there untapped potential to coordinate more, work more together, work more with different groups to have that kind of systematic, long-term impact that really brings about change?
Okay. So I'm going to talk about that, and I'm like thinking to myself, you're trying to get me in trouble talking about church and Black people and money. Oh, Lord. But I'm going to do it. But I would just say, okay, here's my thought about power, is that as philanthropists, we need to be focused on three things: building power, exerting power, and sharing power. Building power, exerting power, and sharing power. So I think it's important that we are actually investing in building power in different places, be it the Black Lives Matter, be it Marlon Hill's campaign for commissioner. We need to be building power, right? Like, we need to make investments in individuals, in groups, and they may not necessarily do it the way that you would do it. That's okay. I always say you want a continuum, right? Like, you want somebody on the far left so that you can get somebody to come to the middle. If you are starting at the middle, then you're more likely to go to the mid-right, and that is not a political statement. It's just a whatever it might be. You get it. The second thing is that we need to exert it. And I don't think that we do that enough. Like, we need to exert our power, be it in small ways or big ways. As you can imagine, I have probably a reputation of talking too much or saying what I think, probably not talking too much. I will say things to leaders in our community who are white people, and I will say it directly, but with radical love. And what I find is that all of the Black people in the room come up to me afterwards, "I'm glad you could say that." I'm like, well, you could say it too. And I understand the risks that are associated with it, but you can back people up on certain things. You can begin to call people in, start lining up activities and behaviors that can influence the way that you create, that you can exert power. And I can give examples of that, but I just really think that that's important. And then the last is sharing it. Like, anybody that clutches on power for themselves, that's like you're being self-serving. And so we have to really make sure that we share it and that we're expanding it. And I think that I talk about power all the time because power is the ability to redefine the rules. That's the only way you can redefine the rules. And so if you don't have it, and I think that in the African American experience, we have first gone after political power with hopes that political power will give us economic power. I think that we have to be thinking far more intentionally about how we create economic power and how economic power drives political power and how it might drive social and influential power and the like. And then Matthew was telling us we got to wrap up. And then one last thing I would just say about this, which is about the church and the tithing. I think it's the same thing. Like, so you guys, somebody in here is a Bible scholar and they're going to get mad at me. My thing is God said give 10% back to him. He didn't say give 10% back to the church. And so for me and my house, we give back. We try to give back a considerable amount of money, and we give it across the board. We count that, and we give significantly to our church too, but we give it significantly to the issues that we think are going to create a betterment for all people. And we do it with an explicit, unapologetic Black lens. And I'm saying that not because I'm saying like we should be isolationists. I'm saying it because it's a targeted universalism. If you can support the people who are struggling the most, that those solutions actually the solutions that come out of that are going to actually support everybody in a better way than just trying to do small groups. And so we are unintentional about it. And I think that we can give our tithes, which is about supporting and advancing God's work, which also, if advancing and supporting God's work doesn't happen outside of the church, then I think we actually have failed at supporting God's work. So I think we got to move our philanthropy.
So there are two more.
Are you sure?
There are two more aspects of power I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on. What about the power of the narrative, and what about the power of the arts? The power of the narrative is something that foundations sometimes get wrong when they're going out to serve, say, underserved populations or whatever, and everything is portrayed. If you want to get a grant, you have to portray what you're applying for in like the worst possible terms. So you're portraying the people that you're trying to help in the worst possible terms so you can get that grant. And you and I both know people who are really working quite well to change the narrative. And then the other area, and these are two separate things, is how important do you think the arts are? Because we see the vibrancy of the arts in both Detroit and Miami. You really feel that in Detroit that Detroit is telling its own story through the arts. And how important is that to identity? I mean, isn't there an aspect of the arts which is about making the invisible visible? So are these forms of power that you take into account and are valuable?
I lost the thought. As you said, arts, and what was the other one?
Yeah, arts about the narrative.
The narrative, okay. So I don't think I give arts enough appreciation, but I am a big supporter of it, and I believe that I actually just think it's a humanity issue. So I always think about it like beauty is our birthright, and we ought to be able to experience it and to tell our stories. And I think of arts as a developmental tool for young people, that it is the first way young people actually learn to master and create. And I also think it's a political statement when I think about arts, particularly for African Americans, because I think a lot of times people think that, we have this narrative about, and I'll get into narrative really quickly, about African Americans, like African Americans are poor. African Americans, they don't own anything. They don't create anything. And I'm like, have you ever been in the world? Like, go any country and you see the American influence on most of those countries, and then when you actually break it down, the American influence usually is the African American influence. And so we're literally creating the culture for our globe, and we are not appreciating it, we don't honor it, we're not investing in it, we're not lifting it up. And so I think it's an important tool to be able to share our stories, to tell the future, to capture the past, to create beauty in the present. But I also think it's also an economic engine that we're underutilizing, and I would love to see us to try and do more of that. And then around narrative, I think we have to move out of this discussion about like what Black people do and don't do and who Black people are. We are just so much more diverse. We need to stop defining ourselves by our deficits. We need to define ourselves by our assets. The one thing, if a youth organization comes and says, I'm saving some kids, I'm like, well, you should go find somebody else to help you. Because our kids don't need to be saved. Like, they're not broken. Now, what they might not have is the right supports. They might not have the right aspirations. They might not have the right opportunities. And what we want to do is give exposure to that and help them and support them and grow them. But we're not trying to fix brokenness. And so we need to stop describing ourselves as being broken. And I think, and we have to start calling the language that's coded, right? Like, I'm even trying to claim my own language. Like, when I'm using coded language, like, what are you really trying to say? Or if people are saying it, like, do you mean? Questioning, asking, and telling the narrative that is both factual. So I'm not saying sugarcoat anything. It has to be factual, but it has to be a narrative of where we're going and who we are, what our aspirations are, defining us by that. And I know many of you guys know Travian Shorters, who is the master at this. And you guys can, I think, do that better than anybody else in this city. As a new city that is continuously building your narrative, you can define what the African-American conversation is, not just in Miami or Florida. I think you can shape it for our country.
That's great. And one small way to contribute is this Saturday, Art and Soul, to raise for the fund for African-American art at the Perez Art Museum. One of the knocks on the Detroit Institute of Art is that it was full of fantastic European art, but it didn't necessarily, people felt that it belonged to them, and I think that Miami is determined that...
That's right, except we do have one hot Kehinde Wiley in there, but...
But anyway, I think Baron Channer from the host committee is here, so if you have any questions about Art and Soul, you can find him. All right. So we're going to take questions on any of these topics and more that we haven't brought up yet. So if you have something you want to ask Tonya, please raise your hand, and someone from Miami Foundation will bring you a microphone. And
don't ask me anything hard. Ask him the hard questions. Give me the softballs.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Michelle Prescott. I work at a nonprofit, it's not the Center for Family and Child Enrichment. And so as I heard you talk about the community safety effort project that you successfully did in Detroit, I heard you talk, you gave the example of going into the hospitals and treating, providing trauma care, trauma center care. How is that funded? Because my nonprofit we do behavioral health, we would love to do something like that, but the reality is, where's the money gonna come from? We have to pay the employees who do it. So how do you work that?
Yeah, so a couple things. When I say we, I'm not actually talking about me. I'm talking about a broad group of stakeholders, so I just wanna be clear about that. Like, all of the accomplished we were able to do was because we actually were a we. And then the second thing I was going to say is that this is the pejorative we, the Skillman Foundation actually gave money to a brilliant surgeon at one of our hospitals who is sick and tired of patching up black men and sending them back on the street after gunshot wounds. And so we invested in him, and then he helped go find additional money from other foundations, from the hospital that made some investments in it. Many of the hospitals have to have some community investment back into the places that they're working. This is one way that they can do it, and especially if a hospital is connected to a health system has charitable dollars, and I would say challenge them to give resources. Your mental health agencies, mental health foundations, those are the kind of places that would help on this trauma issue. And then I would even suggest thinking about federal dollars as well. This is about when we would do violence prevention work with, the office of JJ something in one of the departments in the federal government. They would offer prevention dollars, and you could redesign it around a lot of the prevention work. So think of it as safety work. It is really about safety, how you create community safety, and also how you create and help people deal with the trauma that they're being affected with.
Thank you. I'm Steve Dutton. We met briefly before you began your presentation, which I'm very impressed by. I lead a community organization called Avenue 3 Miami, and we're blessed to be under the umbrella of the Miami Foundation as our fiscal sponsor. I struggle with trying to address a major issue in Miami that, as you were alluding to, your experience in Detroit, has tentacles in lots of different areas. I don't want to create necessarily a structure that builds staff and more overhead than what I'm paying to be fiscally sponsored. I'd like to keep it as inexpensive as possible and focus all the money that we'll raise on what we're trying to accomplish. Any advice in terms of wrestling with that dilemma of, as you mentioned to this young lady in the front, if you go for federal dollars, be prepared, because there's all kinds of auditing and requirements that will require staff to help you through that process. So if you don't want to build a huge organization, what advice can you give then?
Well, I think that if you don't want to build a huge organization, I actually think you just need to share resources. So, you know, I don't want to sound like I'm talking like a business, because I actually am not, but there are some things, you know, when you talk to business people, the first thing they say is, well, you need some mergers and consolidations. I don't actually know if that's true or not. I think it's a little short-sighted to say that before you actually know a business or not. But I do think that you can build a common back office that multiple people can use. And I think that that's one tool that we fully underutilize as a nonprofit sector. So I think, and you know, every time we start something new, I think we have plans of grandeur where we have to have our own CFO, we gotta have our own operations person, we have to have all these individual people, which creates overhead and creates tension on whether or not we can actually execute the program that we want to do, because we're paying for all of these other services. And I really think that we need to figure out like how to build that backbone for multiple organizations who can do it with with efficiency and who can do it cheaply, so that we can get the most resources, the majority of our resources dedicated to the programs we have. And so I don't know if that exists in Miami, but yeah, so I don't know if Miami Foundation doesn't, but if it doesn't mean that you can't do it. And particularly for philanthropists, and many of you probably have great ideas you want to do, and the challenge is that we all have a great idea. Figure out how you can pull those ideas together so that you can get them and do more, and don't build something new if you can rely on somebody else's infrastructure. So there might be a wonderful human service organization that's doing great work on something that's completely unassociated to what you want to do. But you might be able to pay them a small fee, which helps them with their overhead so that they can do the work, you can get your work done, and everybody's stronger as a result of it. So I just would say, look for the innovations and the possibilities, and don't recreate the wheel.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. My name is Jessica Laguerre, and I'm with Princess Training, which is a youth entrepreneurship development program for girls of color. My question would be if you wouldn't mind speaking to, I guess, some of the challenges or your experience through, now that we're seeing an influx of youth entrepreneurship or programs that are targeted towards generational wealth and combating the disparities between communities of colors and non-communities of color.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you said that. I don't think that there are, to your point, not many programs that are focused on generational wealth. I do think that there are trends that are happening in the field that are focused on generational strategies. So we're learning a lot about what we all need to be successful, basic on kind of like brain development. And so what we're finding is that what little kids need are usually the same, like what 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds need with executive functioning skills, et cetera, are the same things that a 21-year-old needs to get a job and to be successful at it. So I think that we are starting to see those kinds of models coming up and supports that are put around it. But it's not around generational wealth, except for, and I'm blanking on the name of the models. There are some models that are basically creating giving circles for families, where you're bringing families together, and families are setting goals together. They're also contributing in pooling their money together, like we've seen in lots of African-centered cultures, and then those monies are then targeted to help people get businesses started and to build wealth. The other thing is that with the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, we have a wealth equity effort that's going on there, which is really about helping men in particular, not girls, think about how you build family wealth, how you build generational wealth, and how you set the trajectory, knowing that you need 4 generations of wealth before wealth is sustainable. 4 generations before wealth is sustainable. So if we're not thinking about that intentionally, because we saw that with Raj Chetty's work that showed up, you know, many of you seen it in the New York Times, where it basically, the sons of wealthy black men are not wealthy, that they lose social class for lots of reasons, but we have to be really intentional about building it, and I think entrepreneurship is a way, but not just them going it alone. I think we as a community have to move beyond this entrepreneurship of like the sole one person going off doing their thing, rather than like, how do we get a full family supporting it? And I always tell the young people, I'm not trying to get you a job, I'm trying to get you to create a job. And then they always say, why? Some of them say, why? And I always say, because I need you to hire my cousin. And the point that I'm making is that black businesses hire black people. Black businesses hire black people. And it's not to suggest that black people shouldn't work for other folks. They should. But if we really want to get economic activity happening in our community, then we need to get more black businesses, because that's the people who generally hire black people first. And so if you want that, if we want to build generational wealth and get income generating in our community, I think that entrepreneurship is the way to it.
You mentioned about Miami being young. It's 123 years old. Detroit is 400 or 500 years old?
Yeah, about 300.
About 300 years old. So in comparison, are there any lessons of philanthropy that the old city can provide to the young city?
don't go into bankruptcy. That's a real lesson. Let me see. You know, I think what I would say is build your own. What I mean by that is that I think that we often are trying to get established philanthropy to rework their rules to support us. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's fine. But I also think that we need to have some resources that are completely dedicated to support the issues that we have. So, and to be thinking about it for the long view. As we kind of move out of, we've out of the industrial area, we are right in the midst, towards the end of this knowledge era, and we're moving into this autonomy era. That transition is going to be extraordinarily hard for all people. But I think it's going to be really hard for Black people in particular, because algorithms are not just going to, they are coded with isms, just like, they are coded with isms. And so if we don't figure out like how to invest in our future, how we put money aside that will help us navigate some pretty significant challenges, that would be the lesson I would learn, because I don't think we did that in Detroit. And so when I think about Detroit, which was not just the wealthiest city, but it was also the wealthiest city for Black people for a really long time, we don't have a legacy of that wealth. We didn't build legacy wealth for ourselves as a community, and that's what I would say for Miami, if I could do it, or if you are well positioned to do it.
How you doing? Right here. Oh. My name is Rodney Jacobs. I actually work for the City of Miami Civilian Investigative Panel. We're essentially our oversight unit for police, similar to like the Detroit Board of Police Commissioners. So my question really hinges on the bankruptcy proceedings. Typically with bankruptcies, you really want to pay as much debt as you can with the littlest amount of money as possible. But doing that in Detroit, in this situation, almost seemed a little bit counterintuitive, because the thing that you needed to fund, the pensions, was the very thing that was going to drive economic prowess for the city. So you needed to be able to pay it in order for money to go into the city. So I guess my question is, how was it, or what was the nexus that really helped people understand that we don't need to shortchange this bankruptcy thing? Because it almost seems that that essence, or those conversations, are the very thing that we need to help people realize about the Black community as well. Because in order for the Black community to remain stronger, to invest, it makes for stronger communities. So something I think within those conversations really helps broaden the idea that we need to invest the right way.
Yeah. Well, I think that we ended up, in the long run, we did prioritize our pensioners towards the end, but they took a haircut. Everybody did. They took a less of a haircut than everybody else. But I don't disagree with you. I mean, that was my point earlier. I think that it is easy to discount the people who don't sit at the table. And so I hate to keep going back to power, but part of what I always say is like, what we need to do is make sure that Black people are sitting at the table and not in a folding chair. And that when you sit at the table, that you also can help set the agenda. And so that's why I think we have to be building power economically, politically, and socially. And so that's why I think the power of philanthropy and the power of Black philanthropy, your ability to assemble and aggregate your efforts together will grow power. It will help you exert it, and it will help you share it. And so I think in the case of Detroit, we did not have that. Like, we had lost it with even though this history of great historic Black power and Black wealth, because of that kind of multiple years of decline, we literally were losing that and not paying attention to it, and as a result of it, our people were harmed by it. So I don't disagree with your principle. I'm just suggesting, like, in hindsight, what do I think we could have done? And it's what I am talking about right now in Detroit quite a bit, is like, we need, and and I don't talk about Black power, I talk about equity, but it's essentially the same thing. Equity is about sharing power so that people can change the rules to support the people with the greatest needs, that they can get the most support. So that's, because I think it's important. If we don't talk about that, if we don't deal with this issue of race in our country, in our cities, in our communities, if we don't wrestle these issues down, we will be hampered by it in this next era that is moving faster, where we have to have everybody contributing.
Good evening. Eric Knowles. I'm the president of the Miami-Dade Chamber of Commerce, which is the Black chamber here in Miami. Been around since 1974. My question to you is, how are you looking at connectors or engaging with baby boomers, millennials, Generation Z, X, whatever is out there? Okay, so that's my question.
So we, as a Children's Foundation, I'll tell you, this is an interesting question. As a Children's Foundation, we're very much committed. Our equity lens is also that young people are at the table and that young people have a say. So even as we're making investments and trying to build systems in Detroit that will create opportunities for young people today and for the long term, one of the things we talk about is that young people are not leaders of the future, they're leaders today, and they ought to be able to contribute to what those systems look like so that it's responsive to what they need. So I think we have deep engagement with young people. I think we also have deep engagement with baby boomers. It's kind of like, so millennials and I feel like we got that covered. We got baby boomers. It's Generation X, which is an enigma. Maybe that's why they called us Generation X. But here are the people who, like, everybody talked about the baby boomers and like the millennials were going to take over from the baby boomers. Well, no, actually there's a whole generation of people before them. And we have not really figured out how to tap into that community. And what I've really been thinking about is trying to figure out how to mobilize that community. So baby boomers are contributing particularly a lot of social capital and financial capital to a lot of issues. Millennials, who the millennials in the room? They think they can do anything, and they can. So they're doing their thing, but what I feel like is we have this absent generation that we can't bridge, that one that we can't do. And so we've been really trying to think about that and trying to figure out like how we use social media to get to that group. And what we found is a couple things, is that when we've used social media with our messaging, like we can get women easily, like, that's our market, like the mama and auntie, that's our market. But we don't get men generally as we get to that space, and I don't think we know how to engage them as well. But I do think we're learning a lot about young people from particularly, even though millennials, you are getting kind of old, millennials, but the Generation I's, like we got them. I think we're learning a lot from them, and we're trying to capture data on that. And the last thing I would just say, the thing that I'm most intrigued about around all of this generational work is artificial intelligence and how it is going to shape our kids' minds. And I don't think we know anything about that. Like when they project out, the futurists, about like what will happen when a young person who is today, when they turn 18, the amount of influences on their brain, just like music influences all of our development of our brains, will have such a great significance. And I don't really understand that, and I'm really curious and trying to push us to think about that, and particularly as we think about education reform.
I'm over here. I'm thinking
thinking about the issue of homelessness in Detroit. And can you share with us some of the mechanisms, activism, and successes that you've had with it?
You know, I think we actually have not had many successes with homelessness in Detroit. I don't think it's a space that we've mastered. I wish I could give you good news and to report out on it. I think we have the same issues you probably have, is that the gentrification, like the places where we had all the homeless shelters are all of the hot places people want to live now. So you see people are being pushed out. And I think that I think that cities are ill-equipped. And so for a place like Detroit, where we actually have an oversupply of homes, we just don't have a way to get people into those homes. But you know, that's the least of the problem, right? Like actually getting somebody in a house, it's really whether they want to be in the house, what kind of supports they have to stay in that home. We just are, we're insufficient. We're doing a terrible job is the best way I can describe that, the most honest way.
Well, we're pretty much out of time, as Matthew is signaling by coming up here. I just want to wrap by just saying, like, look, this was a powerful discussion and actually inspirational. It was.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for being here and, you know, talking about creating opportunity, talking about building wealth. And I just thought it was interesting also how the conversation flowed from philanthropy to business investment, and it's just about having a vision and building this vision. So thanks for coming from Detroit and sharing that with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tonya and Andrew, so very much for that engaging and enlightening conversation. So we started this evening saying that this would be a dialogue that resulted in taking action. So if you will see on the back of your program, there are all these different ways in which you can advance the state of Black philanthropy. So next year, when we gather at the same event, I want every single person to walk in with a story about the one thing that they decided to do from this list and how it made an impact not only for Black communities in Miami, but Black residents and the broader well-being of our city. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Tonya, for flying down from cold Detroit, where she is back on her way to. So we will have to take some really quick photos, and she will have to make it to the airport because we know how Miami traffic can be. So thank you for joining us this evening, and please be safe getting home. All right, you can actually stay.